Hello, this is Reading Rails and I'm Mike Stone, and today I'm going to continue looking at object extensions. So last time we looked at blank and is present. Today I'm going to start with try and see where it goes from there. So looking at the try class, there's a big block of documentation. So let's start by reading it just to get a handle on what this method does. So it invokes the public method whose name goes as first argument, just like public send does, except that if the receiver does not respond to it, the call returns nil rather than raising an exception. This method is defined to be able to write person.try_name instead of person.name if person. Try calls can be chained, so you can say person.try_spouse.try_name instead of person.spouse.name if person and person.spouse. Try will also return nil if the receiver does not respond to the method, so person.try non-existing method will be nil instead of person.non-existing method. If person.respond to non-existing method, then no. Okay, so try returns nil when called on nil regardless of whether it responds to the method. So nil.try2i is nil rather than 0. So okay, that's interesting because nil does respond to 2i and it usually returns 0, but in this case it's going to return nil. I find that useful because oftentimes if you're going to use try, it's because you might end up with a nil somewhere in the chain, as we've seen in kind of the previous documentation. So in this case, try is going to then just, block the nil from, returning an unexpected value. So you might have done 2i on some object that does respond to 2i, but then somewhere in the chain you got a nil, and then the 2i would have unexpectedly given you 0 instead of some other object. So I like that. That's cool. Arguments and blocks are forwarded to the method if invoked. So try each slice 2, do A, B, and okay, so that just means that if it doesn't just work on methods with no arguments like 2i, it also works on methods such as each slice, which takes both arguments and a block. The number of arguments in the signature must match. If the object responds to the method, the call is attempted and argument error is still raised in case of argument mismatch. If try is called without arguments, it yields the receiver to a given block unless it is nil. So at person.try, do p end. So that will just, since there's no method being invoked, it will yield to p unless it's nil. So, you can, do a chain of tries, or you can have some attribute or variable that might be nil and just try, and then if it's non-nil, you can do some stuff with it. That's pretty cool. You can also call try with a block without accepting an argument, and the block will be instance valid instead. So person.try upcase.truncate50. So in this case, instead of having an argument, you have no argument, and then upcase is going to implicitly be called on at person. Please also note that try is defined on object. Therefore, it won't work with instances of classes that do not have object among their ancestors, like direct subclasses of basic object. For example, using try with simple delegator will delegate try to the target instead of calling it on the delegator itself. So let's just see what basic object is. I don't quite know offhand. I've never really seen much reference to it. So basic object, there it is. Basic object is the parent class of all classes in Ruby. It's an explicit blank class. Basic object can be used for creating object hierarchies independent of Ruby's object hierarchy, proxy objects like the delegator class, or other uses where namespace pollution from Ruby's methods and classes must be avoided. To avoid polluting basic object for other users, an appropriately named subclass of basic object should be created instead of directly modifying basic object. Interesting. This is just a very simple object. Okay. I always thought object was the was the base class of all objects, and it's cool to see that, well, actually it's not. All right, so that's all the documentation for try. We got try exclamation, same as try, but we'll raise a no method error exception if the receiver is not nil and does not attempt the tried method. So that means that for nil, it's just gonna fail and do nothing. But if it isn't nil, then it requires that method to be implemented. That differs from try. Let's see, I don't remember where in the documentation it said that. Here. So non-existing method, in that case it just returns nil. So try exclamation point is going to throw an error in that case where you don't have nil, but you have something that doesn't implement a particular method. So let's just play around with that real quick. I'm going to require try. And now if I say nil.try exclamation point undefined method, so we just get nil. But if I have, say, a hash and I say try exclamation point undefined method, this should throw an error, and it indeed does. Whereas if I say try without an exclamation point, it just returns nil. All right, so then nil class. So as we saw, try in the case of nil is always going to return nil. So it makes sense then that the nil class is going to implement it as such. So let's just see real quickly what the meat of this method does, just how it works. So try star a ampersand b. So the star a means that you can have any number of arguments, 0, 1, 2, 3, doesn't matter. And ampersand b is going to take the block like seen up here. So try exclamation point star a ampersand b if a dot empty, or respond to a dot first. In other words, if it's empty, if a is empty, in other words, you have a block, for example, it is going to just delegate this on to try exclamation point. Otherwise, it's going to look to see if it responds to the first method. So if it doesn't respond to the first method, that is like this scenario up here where h.try exclamation point. So in that case, the non-exclamation point method, try undefined method, returns nil. So that's going to be caught here. So h doesn't respond to a dot first, so then it won't come here, which means it's going to return nil. Whereas try exclamation point in all other cases will take care of that. So try exclamation point similarly has any number of arguments plus optionally a block. So if a is empty and a block is given, that's going to be the scenarios like this or like this that have a block. So let's just skip that since that's a little bigger and look at the else public send. And public send, now I don't know what public send does. Presumably that means send for public methods, but I'm going to take a look at that in a second. Public send the star a arguments ampersand b block. Okay, I'll go up here and then we'll come back to public send to see where that's implemented. So if b.arity.0, meaning if there is no arguments to the block, let's just double check that. But so if we have a proc, which the block gets turned into through the ampersand, so b equals proc puts high, b.arity 0. Okay, so if b.arity is 0, then instance eval the block just as this documentation describes. Otherwise, yield self, which is what this documentation describes. So then if we go back to the non-block method, we get the public send. So let's just see if that's something defined in Ruby itself or if it's defined somewhere else. So I'm just going to go back to the main page here. Public send. So it is indeed implemented from object. So public send invokes the method identified by a symbol, passing it any argument specified. Unlike send, public send calls public methods only. When the method is identifiable by a string, the string is converted to a symbol. Thus, public send puts hello causes no method error because one does not implement puts. All right, so let's just see how this works just real quickly. So if I have a class A and then I want to def A and puts hi, and then I want to have a private method def B puts by, and then let's just do a protected method def C puts well hello again. All right, so if we say a.new.a, that does what we expect. a.new.b, private method. a.new.c, protected method. But a.new.send b is going to invoke it, as we'll see. But if we do public send with b, it will not let us do that, and public send c. So as you can see, public send is as if we called the method directly, but using dynamically similar to send. I like that. So this is a pretty simple class. I just want to see what is the testing like for this method. It's a pretty straightforward method, and you know that was pretty easy to go through. So let's just see what the testing looks like in this case. So ActiveSupport.